Welcome back to Hold On Survival Stories, where we bring you the most incredible tales of human endurance that history tried to forget. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most extraordinary Arctic survival stories ever documented. A story of leadership, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit in the face of impossible odds. Before we begin this incredible journey, grab your headphones and settle in. We're about to travel to the frozen hell of the Arctic Ocean in 1913, where 25 people found themselves trapped on ice floes and a barren island, fighting for survival in conditions that had killed countless Arctic explorers before them. If you're new to Hold On Survival Stories, we specialize in bringing you the true accounts of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and discovered they were capable of far more than they ever imagined. These aren't Hollywood movies. These are real people who lived through experiences that will challenge everything you think you know about human limits and the power of leadership under pressure. Today's story takes us to one of the most ambitious Arctic expeditions ever attempted, where scientific discovery became a fight for survival, where a ship's captain became the difference between life and death for dozens of people, and where the frozen wasteland of the Arctic tested every aspect of human endurance and determination. So get comfortable, because what you're about to hear is the story of the Karluk disaster and the remarkable people who refused to surrender to the ice that tried to claim their lives. The year was 1913, and the world was captivated by the race to explore Earth's last uncharted frontiers. The Canadian Arctic expedition, led by the renowned explorer Vilhjalmur Stefansson, represented one of the most ambitious scientific ventures ever attempted in the polar regions. The expedition's goal was to map unknown territories, conduct scientific research, and establish Canada's presence in the contested Arctic islands. The flagship of this expedition was the Karluk, a 247-foot brigantine that had originally been built as a whaling vessel. The ship was sturdy and experienced in ice-packed waters, but she was never designed for the kind of prolonged ice entrapment that the Arctic could inflict on unwary vessels. Her wooden hull, while strong, was vulnerable to the crushing pressure that Arctic ice could generate. Captain Robert Bartlett, a seasoned Newfoundland sailor with years of Arctic experience, commanded the Karluk. At 38 years old, Bartlett was widely regarded as one of the most skilled ice navigators in the world, having served with Robert Peary on his North Pole expeditions. His knowledge of Arctic conditions and his ability to lead men under extreme pressure would prove crucial in the months ahead. The Karluk's complement included 25 people: crew members, scientists, photographers, and support staff. Among them was some of the most respected researchers of their time, including anthropologist Diamond Jennis, geologist George Mollick, and marine biologist Fritz Johansson. These were educated, civilized people who had joined the expedition expecting scientific adventure, not a fight for survival. On August 17, 1913, the Karluk departed from British Columbia, bound for the Arctic Ocean via the Bering Strait. The expedition members were optimistic and excited about the discoveries that lay ahead. They had no way of knowing that they were sailing toward one of the most devastating Arctic disasters in exploration history. The journey north proceeded normally
until the ship reached the Beaufort Sea, where ice conditions were worse than anyone had anticipated. By September 1913, the Karluk found herself trapped in pack ice that stretched to the horizon in every direction. What had begun as temporary delays became a permanent prison as the ice pack consolidated around the ship. Stefansson, the expedition leader, made a controversial decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On September 20th, he left the trapped ship with 5 companions, ostensibly to hunt caribou and establish supply bases. He took the expedition's best dogs, most of the ammunition, and much of the survival equipment, promising to return within days. Stefansson never returned. Whether his absence was due to accident, poor judgment, or deliberate abandonment remained a subject of bitter controversy. What was certain was that his departure left the Karluk's company without their official leader, much of their equipment, and their most experienced Arctic explorer, just as their situation was becoming desperate. Captain Bartlett found himself responsible not just for his ship and crew, but for the entire scientific party that had never expected to face life-threatening survival conditions. The burden of leadership for 25 lives fell on his shoulders as the Arctic ice began to demonstrate its terrifying power. The ice pack that held the Karluk was not static. Driven by winds and currents, it moved constantly, carrying the ship farther from land and deeper into the Arctic Ocean. The pressure created by moving ice floes could crush even the strongest ships, and the crew could hear the ominous sounds of wood creaking and groaning under enormous pressure. As autumn turned to winter, temperatures plummeted, and the brief Arctic daylight gave way to the endless darkness of polar night. The ship became an isolated outpost of human life in a landscape that seemed designed to extinguish any trace of warmth or hope. Food supplies, originally planned to last for a specific expedition timeline, had to be rationed as it became clear that their ordeal might continue indefinitely. Fresh water became a concern as the ship's systems struggled with extreme cold, and heating the vessel required careful management of limited fuel supplies. The psychological pressure on the expedition members was enormous. Scientists who had expected to conduct research found themselves facing the possibility of death in one of the most remote places on Earth. They were completely cut off from civilization, with no way to communicate their situation or request rescue. Captain Bartlett began preparing for the possibility that the Karluk might be destroyed by ice pressure. He organized the crew and expedition members into work parties, established emergency procedures, and began stockpiling supplies that could be moved quickly if the ship had to be abandoned. By December 1913, the ice pressure on the Karluk had become constant and severe. The ship's hull was being squeezed by forces that could generate thousands of tons of pressure, and everyone aboard could hear the sounds of structural damage as the vessel fought a losing battle against the ice. The expedition members faced a stark reality. They were trapped in a slowly disintegrating ship hundreds of miles from land in the middle of an Arctic winter that would kill them if they were forced onto the ice. Their survival would depend entirely on their ability to work together under the leadership of a ship's captain who had never expected to become responsible for so many lives under such desperate circumstances. As the new year of 1914 began, the Karluk continued her losing battle against the ice, and the 25 people aboard prepared for what seemed like an inevitable catastrophe that would test every aspect of their courage, endurance, and determination to survive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. On January 10th, 1914, the inevitable finally happened. After months of fighting the relentless pressure of Arctic ice, the Karluk's hull could no longer withstand the crushing forces that surrounded her. The sound that Captain Bartlett and his 24 companions heard that morning was the death cry of their ship, a series of sharp cracks and groans that meant their floating home was about to become their tomb. The ship's destruction was both sudden and gradual. For hours, the crew had listened to the sounds of wood splintering and metal bending as the ice squeezed the Karluk's hull like a giant fist. Then, with a sound like thunder, the ship's back broke. Water began pouring into the hold as the Arctic Ocean claimed what the ice had killed. Captain Bartlett had been preparing for this moment for months, and his preparations saved lives. Emergency supplies had been organized and cached, survival equipment had been assembled, and every person aboard knew their role in abandoning ship. But knowing what to do and actually doing it in Arctic conditions with a sinking ship were entirely different challenges. The temperature was minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an exposed person within minutes. The wind created a chill factor that made any exposed skin vulnerable to instant frostbite. Working to evacuate the ship required everyone to risk their lives simply to save the equipment that might keep them alive once they reached the ice. The race to evacuate the Karluk was desperate and dangerous. Essential supplies had to be moved from the ship to the ice while the vessel was still partially afloat, but the ice itself was unstable and dangerous. Ice floes could shift suddenly, opening leads of water that could swallow supplies or people without warning. Food became the most critical priority. The expedition's remaining supplies represented the difference between survival and starvation for 25 people who might need to live on the ice for months. Every pound of food saved from the ship could mean additional days of life for the survivors. Scientific equipment and personal belongings had to be abandoned as survival took priority over everything else. Researchers who had devoted their careers to their instruments and specimens watched helplessly as years of work disappeared into the Arctic Ocean along with the dying ship. The sled dogs, essential for transportation and potentially for food if starvation became extreme, had to be moved to the ice along with their food and equipment. These animals would prove crucial for survival, but managing them in the chaos of the ship's destruction added another layer of complexity to the evacuation. Tents, sleeping bags, and clothing became life-or-death priorities. In Arctic conditions, adequate shelter and warm clothing were not luxuries, but absolute necessities for survival. The difference between having proper gear and being inadequately equipped was the difference between life and death. Building a camp on the ice presented challenges that none of the expedition members had faced before. The ice was not solid ground, but a constantly shifting platform that could crack, move, or disappear without warning. Establishing shelter required finding ice thick enough to support tents and supplies, while also providing some protection from the constant Arctic wind. The psychological impact of watching the Karluk disappear beneath the ice was devastating for everyone involved. The ship had been their connection to civilization, their shelter from the Arctic, and their means of eventual return home. With her destruction, they became castaways on an ice floe in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, with no realistic hope of rescue. Captain Bartlett became the undisputed leader of the group as they faced their new reality.
His Arctic experience and natural leadership abilities made him the obvious choice to organize their survival efforts. But the responsibility for 24 lives in such desperate circumstances was enormous. The immediate challenge was establishing a routine that would keep everyone alive on a daily basis. Food had to be rationed carefully to last as long as possible, but people also needed adequate nutrition to maintain body heat and energy in the extreme cold. Water had to be obtained by melting ice, a process that required precious fuel. Shelter became a constant battle against the elements. Tents provided some protection from wind and snow, but they were inadequate for the extreme temperatures and constant storms that characterize the Arctic winter. Everyone had to work together to maintain and improve their shelters while also conserving body heat and energy. The ice floe that supported their camp was itself moving constantly, drifting with currents and winds that carried them farther from land. They were passengers on a frozen ship that could break apart at any moment, stranding them in the Arctic Ocean with no way to reach safety. Navigation became crucial for any hope of eventual rescue or escape. Captain Bartlett used his maritime skills to track their position and movement, but the constantly changing ice conditions made an accurate navigation very difficult. They needed to know where they were to have any chance of reaching land or being found by rescue parties. As January progressed, the reality of their situation became increasingly clear. They were 25 people, stranded on Arctic ice, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, with limited supplies and no means of communication with the outside world. Their survival would depend entirely on their ability to work together under Captain Bartlett's leadership and their collective determination to stay alive until help could arrive or they could reach safety. The destruction of the Karluk had transformed a scientific expedition into a fight for survival that would test every aspect of their physical endurance, mental resilience, and human cooperation. They were about to discover what ordinary people could accomplish when their lives depended on refusing to surrender to seemingly impossible circumstances.
Life on the ice floe became a daily battle against forces that could kill them at any moment. The 25 survivors of the Karluk found themselves living on a platform of ice that was simultaneously their salvation and their potential grave, drifting through the Arctic Ocean with no control over their destination or their fate. The ice beneath their feet was in constant motion, grinding against other floes with sounds like thunder that reminded them constantly of their precarious situation. Pressure ridges could form suddenly, buckling the ice and destroying their carefully constructed camp. Open leads of water could appear without warning, threatening to swallow supplies, equipment, or people. Captain Bartlett organized the survivors into work parties that divided the enormous task of staying alive in Arctic conditions. Some people were responsible for maintaining and improving shelter, others for managing food and water supplies, and still others for caring for the sled dogs that represented both transportation and potential emergency food. The cold was so intense that it became a living enemy that attacked constantly. At -50 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin could freeze in minutes, and even breathing the air was painful and dangerous. Every task, from cooking food to repairing equipment, became a careful balance between necessary work and protection from fatal exposure. Food rationing became a matter of mathematical precision that could determine who lived and who died. Captain Bartlett calculated their supplies against their unknown survival time and established portions that would keep everyone alive as long as possible, while maintaining enough strength for the physical work that survival required. The psychological challenges of their situation were as dangerous as the physical ones. Living in constant uncertainty about their fate, with no knowledge of when or if rescue would come, created stress that threatened to break down the cooperation and discipline that their survival required. Some members of the group struggled more than others with the harsh realities of their situation. James Murray, the expedition's biologist, became increasingly difficult and argumentative, challenging Bartlett's leadership and creating tension that endangered the group's cohesion. Maintaining discipline and morale became as important as managing food and shelter. The dogs provided transportation and labor, but they also required food and care that consumed precious resources. The decision of when to feed the dogs versus saving food for humans became a constant dilemma that balanced immediate needs against long-term survival planning. Navigation remained crucial, but extremely difficult on moving ice. Bartlett used every available method to track their position and movement, but the constantly changing conditions made accurate navigation nearly impossible. They could only estimate their location and hope they were drifting toward land rather than deeper into the Arctic Ocean. The ice floe that supported their camp gradually shrank as pieces broke off and drifted away. Their living space became smaller and more precarious as the weeks passed, and they faced the constant threat that their entire platform could break apart and leave them stranded in the frigid waters of the Arctic Ocean. Equipment maintenance became a daily struggle against the destructive effects of extreme cold and constant use. Metal became brittle and could shatter without warning. Fabric tore easily in the dry cold, and any mechanical device required constant attention to keep functioning in temperatures for which it was never designed. Sleep became nearly impossible due to the combination of cold, discomfort, and constant anxiety about their situation. The noise of grinding ice and shifting floes made rest difficult, and the need to maintain watch for dangerous changes in ice conditions meant that someone had to be alert at all times. Water procurement required melting ice using precious fuel, but the quality of ice varied dramatically. Some ice was contaminated with salt water that could worsen dehydration, while other ice was clean enough to provide the fresh water essential for survival. Learning to identify good ice became a crucial survival skill. Personal hygiene became nearly impossible in conditions where removing clothing could cause fatal exposure. The accumulation of dirt, grease, and sweat created health problems and added to the psychological stress of their situation. But addressing these issues required resources they could not spare. The constant threat of the ice breaking apart forced the survivors to live in a state of permanent readiness to move their camp at a moment's notice. Essential supplies were kept packed and ready to move, but this preparation came at the cost of comfort and efficiency in their daily survival routine. As February 1914 progressed, it became clear that their ice floe was carrying them toward Wrangel Island, a barren landmass that offered the possibility of more stable ground, but also presented new challenges for survival. The approach to land would require crossing dangerous ice conditions and establishing a new survival routine on an island that had killed previous expeditions. The survivors faced the realization that reaching land, while offering some advantages, would not end their ordeal. Wrangel Island was uninhabited, offered limited resources, and was so remote that rescue would be extremely difficult, even if their location became known to the outside world. Captain Bartlett made the crucial decision to attempt to reach Wrangel Island rather than continuing to drift on the increasingly unstable ice floe. This decision would require crossing dangerous ice conditions, but it offered the possibility of more stable shelter and the chance to establish a base that rescue parties might eventually find. The journey from their ice camp to Wrangel Island would test every survival skill they had developed and every reserve of strength and determination they possessed. They were about to leave their precarious but familiar ice floe for an unknown land that might offer salvation or become their final resting place. As they prepared for the dangerous crossing to Wrangel Island, the 25 survivors of the Karluk faced the knowledge that their ordeal was far from over, but they also carried the hope that reaching land might provide the stability and resources they needed to survive until rescue could arrive.
The journey from their disintegrating ice floe to Wrangel Island became a nightmare that tested the survivors beyond anything they had yet experienced. What should have been a march to safety became a deadly gauntlet that would claim lives and scatter the group across one of the most remote and hostile places on Earth. The ice between their floe and Wrangel Island was a chaotic maze of pressure ridges, open water leads, and unstable surfaces that could collapse without warning. Moving 25 people and their essential supplies across this terrain required careful planning and constant vigilance, but it also demanded speed before their ice platform completely disintegrated. Captain Bartlett organized the crossing in stages, with advance parties scouting routes and establishing supply caches while the main group followed with the bulk of their equipment. This strategy distributed the risk, but also divided their strength at a time when unity was crucial for survival. The crossing claimed its first victim when Niven, the expedition's photographer, fell through weak ice into the frigid Arctic Ocean. Despite immediate rescue efforts, the combination of shock, hypothermia, and the stress of months of survival had weakened him beyond recovery. His death was a devastating blow to group morale and a stark reminder of how easily any of them could die. Weather conditions during the crossing were brutal even by Arctic standards. Blizzards reduced visibility to zero while creating wind chills that could kill exposed skin in minutes. The survivors had to balance the need to keep moving against the necessity of seeking shelter when conditions became unsurvivable. The sled dogs that had been essential for transportation began dying from exhaustion, inadequate food, and the extreme conditions. Each dead dog represented not just the loss of transportation, but also the loss of potential emergency food that might keep the humans alive in desperate circumstances. Equipment failures became more frequent and more dangerous as the crossing continued. Sleds broke under the stress of rough ice, essential tools were lost when ice gave way unexpectedly, and clothing began to deteriorate from constant use in extreme conditions. Every equipment loss reduced their chances of long-term survival. The group became separated during the crossing as different parties moved at different speeds and faced different obstacles. Communication between separated groups became nearly impossible in the vast ice fields, creating uncertainty about who was alive and where they might be found. When the first survivors finally reached Wrangel Island in March 1914, they found a landscape that offered both hope and new challenges. The island provided stable ground that would not break apart beneath them, but it also proved to be a barren, wind-swept wasteland that offered few resources for survival. Wrangel Island had a history of killing Arctic expeditions. Previous groups had attempted to survive there and had died from starvation, scurvy, exposure, and the psychological stress of isolation. The survivors of the Karluk were about to add their own chapter to this grim history. The island's terrain was dominated by rocky hills, frozen tundra, and beaches lined with massive chunks of sea ice driven ashore by Arctic storms. Vegetation on the island was minimal and consisted mostly of low-growing Arctic plants that provided little nutrition. Fresh water was available from snow and ice, but fuel for melting it remained a constant concern. Wildlife on the island was scarce and difficult to hunt. Arctic foxes provided some meat, but were wary and hard to catch. Seals could occasionally be found along the shore, but hunting them required skills and equipment that few expedition members possessed. Birds were present during brief summer months, but were absent during the long Arctic winter when food was most desperately needed. Shelter construction on Wrangel Island required adapting to new challenges. The rocky ground made it difficult to secure tents properly, while constant wind required more substantial protection than their equipment could provide. Building shelters from available materials became a crucial survival skill that determined who stayed warm and who risked fatal exposure. The psychological impact of reaching land was complex and contradictory. While the stability of solid ground was emotionally reassuring after months on shifting ice, the barren landscape and evidence of previous expedition failures made their long-term prospects seem even more hopeless. Captain Bartlett realized that their survival on Wrangel Island would require external rescue rather than self-sufficiency. The island's resources were inadequate to sustain 25 people indefinitely, and their isolation made discovery by passing ships extremely unlikely. Someone would have to leave the island to bring help, or they would all eventually die there. The decision of who should attempt to reach civilization for help was crucial and controversial. The journey would be extremely dangerous, crossing hundreds of miles of shifting ice and open water with minimal equipment and supplies. Whoever made the attempt might die in the effort, but without it, everyone would certainly die on the island. Food rationing became even more critical on Wrangel Island as the survivors realized that their supplies would have to last until rescue arrived or until they could develop sustainable hunting and gathering techniques. The mathematical equation of calories versus survival time became a daily calculation that determined everyone's fate. Medical problems began to emerge as the stress of months of survival took its toll on everyone's health. Scurvy from lack of fresh food, infections from untreated wounds, and exhaustion from constant struggle weakened the survivors just when they needed maximum strength to establish their island survival routines. The group dynamics that had held together during their ice ordeal began to fracture under the new stresses of island survival. Conflicts over leadership, resource allocation, and survival strategies created tensions that threatened the cooperation essential for group survival. As spring 1914 arrived on Wrangel Island, the survivors faced a stark choice. Someone had to attempt the dangerous journey to civilization to bring rescue, or they would all gradually weaken and die on an island that had already claimed the lives of numerous previous expeditions. Captain Bartlett prepared to make the ultimate leadership decision, to leave his people behind and attempt one of the most dangerous rescue journeys in Arctic history, knowing that failure would doom everyone he was trying to save.
On March 18, 1914, Captain Robert Bartlett made one of the most difficult decisions in the history of Arctic exploration. He would leave 22 survivors on Wrangel Island and attempt to cross 700 miles of shifting ice, open water, and hostile territory to reach civilization and organize a rescue operation. It was a decision that required abandoning the people who depended on him in order to save them. Bartlett chose Karluk, an Inuit hunter, as his sole companion for the journey. Karluk's traditional Arctic survival skills and knowledge of ice conditions would be essential for navigating the treacherous route to the Siberian mainland. Together, they would attempt what seemed impossible, crossing the frozen Arctic Ocean with minimal supplies and equipment. The psychological burden of leaving his people behind was enormous for Bartlett. As a ship's captain, he had always believed that the captain should be the last to leave his vessel and the last to abandon his crew. But their survival situation required that he violate this fundamental principle of maritime leadership in order to save lives. The survivors left on Wrangel Island faced their own psychological crisis as they watched their leader disappear across the ice. Bartlett had been the organizing force that held the group together, the decision-maker who rationed food and planned their survival strategy. His departure left them without clear leadership at a critical time. Bartlett and Karluk carried minimal supplies, a small amount of food, basic navigation equipment, a rifle with limited ammunition, and emergency gear. They traveled light to maximize their speed and mobility, but this also meant they had no margin for error or delays. Any significant problem could prove fatal. The first challenge was crossing the 90 miles of shifting ice between Wrangel Island and the Siberian coast. This ice was constantly moving, breaking apart, and reforming in patterns that could trap travelers or leave them stranded on isolated floes. Navigation across this terrain required both skill and luck. The temperature during their crossing was consistently below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes and to make normal human activity extremely difficult. Every task, from setting up shelter to preparing food, became a careful balance between necessity and fatal exposure. Food and water were constant concerns during the crossing. They had to melt ice for drinking water, using precious fuel, while their food supplies dwindled with each day of travel. Hunting was possible but unpredictable, and any time spent hunting was time not spent traveling toward help. The physical demands of Arctic travel pushed both men to their limits. Walking across rough ice for 12 to 15 hours per day while pulling a sled and carrying essential equipment required strength and endurance that few people possess. The soft snow and unstable ice made each step exhausting. Sleep became a dangerous necessity that had to be balanced against the need to keep moving. In their minimal shelter, exposed to Arctic winds and temperatures, rest was difficult and never adequate. But traveling without sleep would lead to mistakes that could be fatal in such unforgiving conditions. After 2 weeks of desperate travel, Bartlett and Karluk reached the Siberian coast. But their journey was far from over. They still had to cross hundreds of miles of hostile territory to reach a settlement with communication capabilities that could organize a rescue operation. Siberia in 1914 was a vast wilderness with scattered native settlements and virtually no infrastructure. Finding help required locating people who could provide transportation, food, and communication with the outside world. This search could take weeks or months, while the survivors on Wrangel Island gradually weakened and died. The native peoples of Siberia provided crucial assistance to Bartlett's rescue mission. Despite language barriers and cultural differences, they understood the urgency of his situation and provided transportation, food, and guidance that allowed him to continue his journey towards civilization. The overland journey across Siberia became an endurance test that rivaled their ice crossing. Traveling by dog sled, reindeer, and on foot across frozen rivers, mountain passes, and endless tundra, Bartlett covered hundreds of miles while fighting exhaustion, inadequate food, and the constant pressure of knowing that every day of delay might mean more deaths on Wrangel Island. Weather conditions in Siberia created additional delays and dangers. Blizzards could strand travelers for days, while spring thaw made river crossings dangerous and unpredictable. Bartlett had to balance speed against safety, knowing that reaching help quickly was crucial,
but that dying en route would doom the survivors he was trying to save. Communication with the outside world became possible when Bartlett finally reached settlements with telegraph connections to major cities. But even then, organizing a rescue operation required convincing authorities that the Karluk survivors were still alive and that a rescue mission was both possible and worthwhile. The bureaucratic challenges of organizing an international rescue operation added frustration to Bartlett's physical ordeal. Different governments had to coordinate their efforts. Ships had to be acquired and equipped, and supplies had to be assembled while the Arctic summer window for reaching Wrangel Island rapidly approached. Bartlett's journey from Wrangel Island to civilization took nearly 4 months, during which he covered over 1,000 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. His success in reaching help and organizing a rescue operation represented one of the most remarkable leadership achievements in exploration history. But even as rescue ships prepared to depart for Wrangel Island, Bartlett faced the agonizing uncertainty of whether his people had survived the months of his absence. He had gambled everything on his ability to reach help quickly enough to save lives, and he would not know the outcome until the rescue ships reached the island. The captain who had abandoned his crew to save them was about to learn whether his impossible journey had been in time to preserve the lives that depended on his success. The fate of the Karluk survivors would be determined by the race between Bartlett's rescue operation and the deadly Arctic conditions that were slowly killing his people on one of the most remote islands on Earth.
Left alone on Wrangel Island after Captain Bartlett's departure, the 22 remaining survivors faced months of uncertainty that tested their physical endurance and psychological resilience in ways that challenged the very foundations of their humanity. They had no way of knowing whether their captain had survived his rescue journey, whether help was coming, or whether they would slowly die in one of the most remote places on Earth. The immediate challenge was establishing leadership in Bartlett's absence. First Officer Alexander Anderson assumed command, but he lacked Bartlett's Arctic experience and natural authority. The group struggled with decision-making and discipline as personality conflicts emerged and survival stress intensified existing tensions. Food rationing became a matter of life and death mathematics that consumed everyone's thoughts and conversations. Anderson had to balance immediate nutritional needs against unknown survival time, making decisions that could determine who lived and who died. Every meal became a careful calculation of calories, nutrition, and group morale. The island's brief Arctic summer brought both opportunities and new challenges. Warmer weather made outdoor work possible and provided access to limited plant foods and bird eggs, but it also brought swarms of insects that could drive people to madness and created wet conditions that made shelter maintenance difficult. Hunting became the group's primary hope for supplementing their dwindling food supplies. Arctic foxes, seals, and occasional polar bears provided protein, but hunting them required skills that few expedition members possessed. Learning to hunt in Arctic conditions became a matter of survival education under the most extreme circumstances. Equipment failures accelerated as months of use in harsh conditions took their toll on essential gear. Tents developed tears that led in deadly cold. Tools broke under the stress of constant use, and clothing deteriorated to the point where some survivors were barely protected from the elements. Medical problems emerged as the stress of prolonged survival weakened everyone's health. Scurvy appeared among those whose diet lacked fresh food, while injuries from hunting and daily survival tasks became infected due to poor sanitation and inadequate medical supplies. The psychological toll of waiting for rescue was devastating. Survivors oscillated between hope and despair as they scanned the horizon for ships that never appeared. The knowledge that Captain Bartlett might already be dead, that no rescue was coming, that they might die forgotten on this remote island, created depression and anxiety that threatened their will to survive. Group dynamics deteriorated as survival stress intensified personality conflicts and exposed character flaws that had been manageable during better times. Arguments over food, work assignments, and leadership decisions became bitter and sometimes violent, threatening the cooperation essential for group survival. The long Arctic night of their second winter on the island brought new psychological challenges. The months of darkness, combined with inadequate food and uncertain fate, created conditions that drove some survivors to the edge of mental breakdown. Maintaining sanity became as important as maintaining physical health. Despite the hardships, some survivors demonstrated remarkable resilience and leadership. Fred Maurer, the expedition's photographer, became instrumental in maintaining group morale and organizing survival activities. His optimism and practical skills provided stability during the darkest periods of their ordeal. The death of James Murray from kidney failure was a devastating blow to group morale and a stark reminder of their mortality. Murray had been difficult and argumentative, but his death forced everyone to confront the reality that they might all die on Wrangel Island if rescue did not arrive soon. Seasonal changes brought new survival challenges that required constant adaptation. Spring thaw made travel around the island difficult and dangerous, while summer brought new food sources, but also insects and unstable ice conditions. Each season demanded different survival strategies and skills. Communication attempts using makeshift signals and messages left for potential rescue parties represented their only connection to hope. Survivors built cairns, left written records, and maintained signal fires when materials permitted, clinging to the possibility that someone might find evidence of their presence. The discovery of previous expedition remains on the island provided both useful supplies and grim reminders of their likely fate. Finding equipment and personal effects from earlier expeditions that had died on Wrangel Island reinforced their understanding of how easily they could join the ranks of the forgotten dead. Work routines became crucial for maintaining both physical survival and psychological stability. Daily tasks like gathering fuel, preparing food, maintaining shelter, and caring for equipment provided structure and purpose that helped combat the despair and helplessness of their situation. Resource management required careful planning and constant attention to conservation. Every piece of fuel, every bit of food, every essential tool had to be used efficiently because replacement was impossible. Waste or carelessness could mean the difference between survival and death for the entire group. The brief Arctic summer of 1914 passed without any sign of rescue, forcing the survivors to prepare for a second winter on the island with depleted supplies and weakened physical condition. The realization that they might face another complete Arctic winter alone was psychologically devastating. As autumn 1914 approached, the survivors faced the terrible possibility that Captain Bartlett had failed in his rescue mission, that no help was coming, and that they would die slowly on Wrangel Island. But they also carried the knowledge that they had survived longer than seemed possible, and that their endurance had exceeded every reasonable expectation. The question was whether their remarkable resilience could sustain them through another Arctic winter,
or whether the accumulating effects of starvation, exposure, and despair would finally overcome their determination to survive until rescue arrived. Standing on the shores of Wrangel Island, scanning the empty horizon for ships that might never come, the survivors prepared for what could be their final test of endurance in one of the most hostile environments on Earth.
On September 7th, 1914, after more than 8 months of isolation on Wrangel Island, the impossible happened. Survivors scanning the horizon through makeshift telescopes spotted something that had existed only in their desperate dreams: ships approaching through the ice-filled waters around the island. The rescue fleet consisted of 3 vessels: the revenue cutter Bear, commanded by Captain Michael Healy, the schooner King and Winge under Captain Louis Olson, and a 3rd support vessel. Captain Bartlett had not only survived his epic journey, but had successfully convinced the U.S. and Canadian governments to mount one of the most ambitious Arctic rescue operations ever attempted. The emotional impact of seeing rescue ships after months of believing they would die forgotten on Wrangel Island was overwhelming for the survivors. Many wept openly, others were too stunned to react, and some initially refused to believe that the ships were real rather than another cruel hallucination brought on by starvation and despair. The rescue operation itself presented significant challenges despite the arrival of help. Ice conditions around Wrangel Island made it impossible for the ships to approach the shore directly, requiring the use of small boats to ferry survivors and their few remaining possessions through dangerous ice-filled waters. When rescue crews reached the survivors' camp, they found people who bore little resemblance to the civilized expedition members who had departed from Canada 15 months earlier. The survivors were emaciated, their clothes reduced to patched rags, their skin weathered and scarred by months of exposure to Arctic conditions. Of the 25 people who had been aboard the Karluk when she was crushed by ice, only 14 survived to sea rescue. 11 had died during the ordeal, some during the crossing from the ice floe to Wrangel Island, others from illness, injury, and the accumulated effects of prolonged survival in extreme conditions. The physical condition of the survivors shocked the rescue crews. Many had lost 40 to 60 pounds from their original body weight, reducing them to skeletal frames that struggled to perform basic physical tasks. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and careful, like those of much older people. Captain Bartlett's reunion with his surviving crew was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The man who had left them to save them was overwhelmed by relief at finding anyone alive, guilt at the deaths that had occurred during his absence, and pride in the remarkable endurance his people had demonstrated. The medical assessment of the survivors revealed the full extent of what they had endured. Scurvy was widespread among those whose diet lacked fresh food, while chronic malnutrition had weakened everyone's immune system and ability to heal from injuries. Several survivors required immediate medical attention to prevent further deterioration. But perhaps most remarkable was the psychological condition of the survivors. Despite months of uncertainty about rescue, deaths of companions, and living conditions that would have broken most people, they had maintained their essential humanity and sanity. Their ability to function as coherent individuals after such extreme trauma impressed even experienced Arctic explorers. The rescue operation revealed the extent of the survivors' resourcefulness and adaptation to their circumstances. Their camp showed evidence of remarkable improvisation and survival skills that had allowed them to extract life from an environment that offered few resources for human survival. Equipment salvaged from the Karluk and modified by the survivors demonstrated incredible ingenuity in adapting tools and supplies to Arctic survival needs. Tents had been reinforced and modified using materials scavenged from the island, while hunting and cooking equipment showed signs of constant repair and improvement. Food supplies discovered by the rescue crews indicated how close the survivors had come to complete starvation. Their remaining stores would have lasted perhaps another few weeks, meaning that the rescue had arrived just in time to prevent additional deaths from malnutrition. The stories told by the survivors revealed the extent of their ordeal and the leadership that had kept them alive during Bartlett's absence. First Officer Anderson and others had made crucial decisions about rationing, shelter, and group discipline that had preserved lives during the most desperate periods. The rescue ships faced their own challenges in evacuating the survivors from Wrangel Island. Ice conditions were dangerous and unpredictable, while the survivors' weakened condition made the evacuation process slow and careful to avoid additional injuries or medical emergencies. Personal effects and scientific equipment left on the island represented years of work and personal memories that had to be abandoned due to space and weight limitations on the rescue vessels. The survivors had to choose between their few remaining possessions and their lives, with survival taking priority over sentiment. The journey from Wrangel Island to civilization represented another challenge for survivors whose bodies had adapted to extreme conditions. Sudden changes in diet, temperature, and activity level could cause dangerous medical complications that required careful management by the ship's medical personnel. Media attention following the rescue drew international focus to the Karluk disaster and the remarkable survival of its crew. The story of their ordeal captured public imagination and made heroes of ordinary people who had demonstrated extraordinary endurance. Captain Bartlett's leadership throughout the disaster became the subject of intense scrutiny and eventual recognition. His decision to leave his crew to save them, his epic rescue journey, and his successful organization of the rescue operation established him as one of the great leaders in exploration history. The scientific equipment and research materials lost with the Karluk represented a significant setback for Arctic research. But the survival story itself provided valuable insights into human adaptation to extreme environments and the leadership qualities necessary for crisis management. As the rescue ships departed Wrangel Island with their precious cargo of survivors, they carried not just rescued people, but living proof that human beings could endure circumstances that seemed designed to destroy them. The Karluk disaster had claimed 11 lives, but it had also demonstrated the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to survive extraordinary challenges through cooperation, leadership, and an unbreakable determination to live. The survivors who had spent over a year fighting for life in one of the most hostile places on Earth were finally going home, carrying with them the knowledge that they had faced the ultimate test of human endurance and had refused to surrender, even when death seemed certain.
The return to civilization for the Karluk survivors marked the beginning of a complex process of physical recovery, psychological healing, and coming to terms with an experience that had fundamentally changed who they were as human beings. The 14 people who stepped off the rescue ships were not the same individuals who had departed for the Arctic 15 months earlier. The immediate medical challenges were significant but manageable. Months of malnutrition had weakened the survivors' bodies in ways that required careful rehabilitation to avoid dangerous complications. Rapid weight gain could stress hearts and digestive systems that had adapted to starvation conditions, so recovery had to be gradual and medically supervised. Psychological adjustment to normal life proved more challenging than physical recovery for many survivors. After months of constant survival focus, where every decision was potentially life or death,
The ordinary concerns of civilized life seemed trivial and meaningless. Some survivors struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The media attention surrounding their rescue was intense and often intrusive. The Karluk survivors became celebrities whose story captured public imagination around the world. But fame came with pressures and expectations that were difficult for people who had been through such extreme trauma. Captain Bartlett received particular recognition for his leadership throughout the disaster. His decision to leave his crew to save them, his epic rescue journey, and his successful organization of the rescue operation were acknowledged as examples of extraordinary leadership under the most extreme circumstances. But Bartlett also carried the psychological burden of the 11 people who had died during the expedition. Despite recognition that his leadership had saved lives, he struggled with guilt over the deaths that had occurred and questioned whether different decisions might have prevented some casualties. The scientific aspects of the expedition were largely lost with the destruction of the Karluk and the abandonment of most equipment and research materials. However, the survival experience itself provided valuable insights into human adaptation to extreme environments and the psychology of crisis survival. The controversy surrounding Vilhelmus Stefansson's abandonment of the expedition continued for years after the rescue. His decision to leave the trapped ship with the best equipment and most experienced personnel was criticized as either poor judgment or deliberate abandonment of his responsibilities as expedition leader. Individual survivors dealt with their experience in different ways. Some, like photographer Fred Maurer, spoke publicly about their ordeal and used their experience to educate others about Arctic survival and the importance of preparation. Others preferred to maintain privacy and tried to return to normal life without dwelling on their trauma. The Karluk disaster led to improvements in Arctic expedition planning and safety procedures. The tragedy demonstrated the importance of emergency communication equipment, adequate supplies for extended survival, and clear leadership protocols for crisis situations. The story became a case study in leadership and crisis management that was studied by military organizations, business schools, and emergency response agencies. Captain Bartlett's leadership style and decision-making process during the disaster provided lessons that extended far beyond Arctic exploration. The physical artifacts recovered from Wrangel Island and the survivors' accounts provided historians with detailed documentation of one of the most extreme survival experiences ever recorded. The story became part of Arctic exploration literature and a testament to human resilience under impossible circumstances. Several survivors wrote books and articles about their experience, contributing to public understanding of Arctic survival and the psychological challenges of extreme isolation. Their accounts provided insights into the human capacity for adaptation and the importance of hope and determination in survival situations. The families of those who died during the expedition received recognition and compensation, but the loss of 11 lives remained a tragic aspect of the story that overshadowed the remarkable survival of the others. The disaster demonstrated both the incredible resilience of human beings and the terrible costs of polar exploration. The technological and logistical lessons learned from the Karluk disaster influenced subsequent Arctic expeditions and contributed to improved safety standards for polar exploration. The tragedy served as a reminder that even well-planned expeditions could face circumstances that tested human limits. Years after their rescue, many survivors remained connected to each other and to the Arctic, bound by shared experience that few other people could understand. Their ordeal had created relationships and insights that lasted for the rest of their lives. The story of the Karluk survivors continues to inspire people facing their own challenges and crises. Their example demonstrates that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things
when their survival depends on cooperation, leadership, and refusal to surrender to seemingly impossible circumstances. Captain Bartlett continued his career in Arctic exploration and became recognized as one of the great polar navigators and leaders. His experience with the Karluk informed his approach to subsequent expeditions and established his reputation as someone who could be trusted with lives under extreme conditions. The environmental challenges that destroyed the Karluk, moving ice, extreme cold, isolation, and limited resources, continue to test Arctic explorers and researchers today. The story serves as a reminder of the power of natural forces and the importance of respecting the environments we seek to explore. Most importantly, the Karluk survivors proved that human beings possess resources for endurance and adaptation that exceed what most people ever discover about themselves. They demonstrated that with proper leadership, cooperation, and determination, people can survive circumstances that seem designed to destroy them. Their story stands as one of the great survival achievements in human history, a testament to the power of leadership in crisis and proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when everything depends on their refusal to give up. The 14 people who survived the Karluk disaster showed the world what humans are truly capable of when they face the impossible and choose to hold on. In the end, the Karluk survivors' greatest achievement was not just staying alive, but maintaining their humanity through circumstances that tested every aspect of their character. They proved that survival is not just about enduring hardship, but about preserving hope, cooperation, and dignity, even when everything seems lost.